It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sasha Gorrell, who received a BA in psychology from Columbia University and a master's degree from New York University in general psychology. She earned her PhD in clinical psychology from the University at Albany SUNY. Go New York, I'm from New York, yay. Joined the UCSF team as a T32 postdoctoral scholar within the NIMH-funded Clifford Atkinson Clinical Services Research Training Program. As an assistant professor in the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, Dr. Gorrell's clinical focus is in treatment of adolescents with restrictive eating disorders, and specifically in supporting their recovery and family-based treatment. Her current NIMH-funded K-23 Career Development Award is focused on investigating specific neurobiological risk and maintenance factors for problematic exercise behavior. She's also specifically interested in exploring translational mechanisms related to reinforcement learning and anxiety that may be targeted within evidence-based treatment for eating disorders. Very excited for your talk. Thank you for being here this afternoon and sharing your work with us. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Sasha Gorrell. Thank you for being here.
Barbara, I'm gonna pop into sharing my screen. It's a pleasure to be here. I am going to be talking about the overlap between anxiety and eating disorders and sharing with you some mechanisms that I've been thinking about and starting some preliminary work with. I have funding, as Barbara mentioned, from the NIMH. I have no other financial disclosures, and I have the privilege of living and working on land that was originally belonging to the indigenous Ohlone people. The learning objectives are published online. If you learn nothing today, that's also okay. I'm just hopeful that something that I'm talking about maybe helps you to think about something differently, shedding maybe a new lens on your current knowledge. My talk will be in 3 parts. In the first part, I'll be sort of laying the groundwork for that conceptual overlap between anxiety and eating disorders. I'll be taking a quick tour through the neurobiology of anorexia nervosa, and then winding up talking about 2 projects specifically that I'm pretty excited about. I'm going to invite you to turn off your camera. I know we spend so much time on Zoom. This is one opportunity maybe where you can put your feet up, maybe go have some lunch. With the gallery view, I can really only see 4 of you. So I'm not mandating you turn the camera off, but inviting you to do so. Starting with part 1, that conceptual overlap that I was talking about. So as of 2013, the DSM-5 identifies these sort of most commonly recognized eating disorders, familiar to most, if not all of us in some way. But I think what I wanted to highlight today at the start of this was just how we tend to think about their differences rather than some of the commonalities. So, thinking more transdiagnostically, if you will. So looking at this initial row, looking at the list of diagnoses that I have there, the fear of weight gain, one of the more sort of hallmark characteristics of ARFID compared to anorexia nervosa is that individuals that present with avoidant restrictive feeding and intake disorder don't necessarily endorse a fear of weight gain. So for differential diagnosis purposes or for selecting a specific type of treatment, we tend to really sort of latch onto that difference as being helpful. But if you look at fear of the consequences of eating, then pretty much every single person who has an eating disorder at some time has experienced a fear of the consequence that is perceived from eating. So for ARFID, this might be emetophobia, the fear of vomiting. There can be fears of weight gain, but also fears of social judgment or fears of a loss of identity. The list goes on. Low weight. I know it's a little contentious that I only put 3 X's there because sometimes you can have low weight, in bulimia nervosa and so on. But what I really want to highlight is that at some point in the disease trajectory of most people with an eating disorder, they are weight suppressed at some point. And so that's valuable to think about that maybe it's not objectively low weight, but it's low weight compared to where this person has been historically. Compensatory behavior, again, sort of an important diagnostic differential that it's, if somebody presents with binge eating, but they don't endorse either self-induced vomiting or some other kind of compensatory behavior, then clinically we can sort of check the box, oh, then they must not have bulimia nervosa, and so we're thinking more about binge eating disorder. However, arguably, functionally, the behavior that maintains eating disorders is really a big part of everybody's presentation. And so just kind of zeroing in on those 3 rows that I've indicated, the fear of the consequences of eating, the weight suppression, and the behavior, those are really transdiagnostic, and they stretch across pretty much every presentation, even the ones that I haven't listed here. So if you look at the bottom of that pie there, weight suppression is pretty unique to eating disorders, and it doesn't necessarily show up in anxiety disorders. But behavior that maintains the disorder, this is definitely part and parcel of anxiety. And then thinking about, as I'm going to continue to talk about, fear being a really important mechanism, both in anxiety, but also in eating disorders particularly. So if I'm sort of positing that there is this overlap, what can we make of that? How big is it? What's the foundation for it? And how does it help us to think differently, maybe about how we're both screening and also treating either one of these disorders? I want you to call your attention first to the bottom left-hand corner here. This paper was published in 2017. So we're talking about 5 years ago, which is really not that long ago. We were already sort of sitting there, arguing that this is an idea worth researching in the International Journal of Eating Disorders, that exposure-based interventions should be expanded. So this is sort of relatively new. Since that time, I worked with several of my colleagues to publish the review in ClinPsych Review. And if you're very interested in this topic, it's a beast of a paper, it's very long, but we really break down both the conceptual overlap, but also the extension, the applicability within exposure-based research. And then more recently, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy, they have a book series, and they published this handbook for exposure for eating disorders. So there's growing and burgeoning interest in it, growing research, but in thinking about sort of the timeline, this is all, relatively speaking, pretty new. So jumping into comorbidity, thinking historically, comorbidity was maybe not the norm. It was more the exception, maybe 3 or 4 decades ago in a presentation of anorexia nervosa. Nowadays, though, there's high levels of comorbidity with the disorders that I list there, but also highlighting for all of you that OCD is particularly comorbid. So 14% lifetime experience of OCD and eating disorders, and roughly 9% currently. And for adolescents with anorexia, roughly 40% have a diagnosis of depression. More than 50% have a diagnosis of social anxiety, and roughly a third have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. Those numbers might not be particularly striking for those of you more familiar with eating disorders, but it is something to note in terms of the relatively high numbers. Even in subclinical eating pathology, there's a high incidence of comorbidity with mood and anxiety disorders. So in this particular study, there were 833 adolescent girls around age 15. The percents that you see there are within this particular sample. So within this sample of 800 plus girls, roughly 11% of them met criteria for subclinical binge eating disorder, which already might be like, that's interesting. But moving into looking at what they found, compared with girls in this sample reporting no eating disorder pathology whatsoever, the girls with subclinical anorexia had higher levels of both anxiety and depression. And I won't go into the nitty gritty of sort of whether it was significant or not, but basically across the board, there were higher levels of meeting criteria for major depression, generalized anxiety, and particularly sort of notably separation anxiety, which I found sort of interesting. This is a study by Sonia Swanson and colleagues, which actually Dr. Lagrange, who's part of our eating disorder program, was a part of. This is a study, a community level study of 10,123 adolescents, so a fairly representative number. And if you look where I've placed those arrows, 55% of those with anorexia nervosa in this sample had some kind of comorbidity, 88% for bulimia, and 83, roughly almost 84% for binge eating disorder. So strikingly high numbers. I starred this as sort of a mental flag for 2 slides from now. So in this case, it was 24% of those with anorexia who had any kind of anxiety disorder specifically. So looking at now, if that was a community sample, what does this look like in a more severe presentation of anorexia nervosa? So in this study, there were 181 female patients who were hospitalized, so arguably a more acute presentation than the study that I just showed you. They were teenage to young adults and reevaluated 6 to 12 years later, which is always sort of an impressive amount of time to get accurate follow-up from. But remember, I wanted to sort of star that for you in terms of the thinking about the 24% in anorexia in that community sample. Well, if you look at the starred numbers here on the right-hand side, general anxiety was over half had a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. Similar numbers for OCD. A third was social anxiety. So thinking about the presentation of greater anxiety within a more severe presentation of eating disorders as well. So then, you get to thinking, well, what about the reverse? I've just spent several minutes talking about what prevalence of anxiety exists within eating disorders. But if you take a whole sample of people who are primarily presenting with anxiety disorders, what % of them might evidence some eating pathology? So there's not a lot of research on this, but what there is right now published, it's pretty interesting. So in this study, there were increased rates of eating disorders and symptoms in adults with major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. And so in this sample, there were 130 women with a lifetime diagnosis of MDD, and you're looking at those as being anxiety disorders per probably a DSM-4 definition. And then they had 405 women with no report. They were evaluated with the SCID, so fairly empirically valid. Staring at this chart for a second, I'm going to walk you through it. So among those women with a lifetime diagnosis of MDD or any of those anxiety disorders, 39%, so almost 40% of women, had some lifetime experience of eating pathology. And that's in contrast to only 13% of those who didn't have that existing disorder. And then the teal bars represent a clinically significant eating disorder behavior at the time of assessment. And again, lower numbers, but looking just at the difference between those who had MDD or anxiety was 11% versus only 3%. So just something to think about, sort of the joint or synergistic risk for both. What does that comorbidity do, though, when we treat the eating disorder? So thinking about, does it move? Does it react? Does it actually benefit from eating disorder treatment? So this is a study that came out of our group just about 2 years ago. We did some secondary data analysis on 107 adolescents who had received FBT, family-based treatment, which is our gold standard for anorexia. And I highlighted with that red arrow the significant drop in major depressive disorder from pre and post. So this was measured with the mini kids, so meeting criteria for the disorder versus not. And for those of us who sort of have an intuitive sense of what nutrition does to the brain, it makes sense, right? That some of that depression was secondary just to malnutrition. And so thinking about intuitively, you would imagine that some of that depression would remit. But thinking about, if malnutrition is impacting the brain in a positive way over the course of treatment, and if you kind of scan to the right, looking at the differences pre-post from panic and from GAD and obsessive compulsive disorder, you don't see that sharp drop. So it seems as if the anxiety was really more entrenched and less likely to remit over the course of eating disorder treatment. So how do these two disorders, if they are sort of hanging on even post-eating disorder treatment, how do they interact? What does a behavioral conceptualization of that look like? So on the left-hand side, a trigger or a cue for somebody with an eating disorder, if it's associated with prior learning, that there's an undesired consequence associated with that cue. Then the emotional response is evoked, typically distress or anxiety of some sort, maybe guilt, sort of list any negative emotion, and that could be in the mix. which would then lead to engagement in an eating disorder behavior in an effort to either decrease that response or to avoid the negative consequences. And then the after effects of that behavior sort of reducing either by positively enforcing or negatively enforcing, the feared consequence, then you get stuck in that sort of 3, 4, 5 box loop. So, I've described here sort of what it might look like for somebody who's engaging in an eating disorder behavior. But if you substitute in an adolescent who is experiencing anxiety, you could sort of trace the same path for engagement in a safety behavior or something that would then help them to avoid the feared consequences and getting stuck in the same loop. And I want to invite you to consider also that oftentimes we think about how, the adolescent situated within a family dynamic, that, if we're talking about anxiety disorders, sometimes modeling or sort of intolerance of negative emotion from the family context sort of pours some fuel, if you will, on this fire. And so we see the same things occurring in eating disorders. So parents and other family members sort of certainly not causing, but helping to kind of keep some of these structures in place. I'm going to walk you through this a little bit more slowly, just because I've spent a couple of minutes now talking about the overlap, but I really want to exaggerate some of the focus on the differences, because I think that they are important in thinking about sort of mechanisms and what we might be targeting. So up there in the first row, the cultural context, some amount of anxiety is culturally normative and actually necessary. If we didn't have any anxiety at all, we wouldn't be human. We wouldn't be motivated by certain things. We wouldn't actually be able to protect ourselves. In contrast, there's, mental health stigma, globally speaking, but also at a higher level for eating disorders, that there's sort of this perception, the assumption that it's the choice of the adolescent to engage in that behavior. And of course, those of us more savvy and sort of on the other side of it know that that's not the case, but it's much more difficult to sort of normalize eating behavior than it would be for anxiety. The popular belief that talking about anxiety makes it better is actually almost completely the opposite, where the perception is that if we talk about eating disorders, then it's going to flare them up. Sometimes I think of it similarly to suicide, where sometimes people think that talking about suicide is going to make it worse, where it's actually the opposite. And we find that with eating disorders as well. Awareness of anxiety, there's so much self-help, there's so many meditation apps now, it's almost kind of trendy to sort of address anxiety, if you will. Where in contrast, the awareness of eating disorders, we can do as much advocacy and outreach and education as possible, and yet there's still sort of messaging perceptions of the fact that if you're not at a low weight, then certainly you can't be suffering from eating pathology. The personal experience, this row is actually maybe one of the ones that's a little bit more important than the others. The personal experience of an individual with anxiety is typically ego dystonic. Please help me get rid of this anxiety. And then on the same token, their worst fears, it's obviously sometimes your worst fears will come true, but oftentimes, you can sort of help somebody with an anxiety disorder to challenge those distorted cognitions and realize that much as they fear these things, they won't actually come true. So if you think about this on the flip side with people with eating disorders, there is shame oftentimes about even sort of falling prey to the eating disorder, if you will. That's the perception. And yet at the same time, there's this sort of strange flip side of that much of the behavior is ego syntonic. And so it's, it's sort of in a veil of secrecy, that there's a motion to kind of hold on to the eating disorder for fear of losing aspects of it. And this is super important clinically, that for many, if not all patients with restrictive eating disorders, their worst fear is sometimes weight gain. And that very often comes true. And so it's sort of, you can help people to challenge their beliefs, but in some ways, from that perspective, an acceptance-based approach is sometimes more helpful in the sense of realizing that while it is distressing, it's not something that they're necessarily distorting. In terms of a clinical approach, there is currently, thankfully, a widespread acceptance of exposure-based approaches. Typically, there's enough sort of foundation of that literature. Where historically, and I think somewhat based on timidity, based on medical acuity, which makes a lot of sense, that these individuals with, eating disorders of the low weight kind, anorexia specifically, there's a perception that they might not be able to tolerate something that's, sort of aggressive, if you will, with exposure. And so what we've found more recently with, sort of emerging literature is that that's not the case, that, sort of there's not this fragility that's perceived about people with anorexia nervosa, and they can actually tolerate exposure, of course, with clinical judgment when it's appropriate. But it's something that, as I was mentioning before, this is really only about 5 years old. So part one recap, just to kind of zero us back into what I've been talking about there. Hopefully I've convinced you that there is a conceptual overlap between these two disorders. Sort of pointed out the high rates of comorbidity and how striking they can be, especially in more severe presentations of eating disorders. There are notable eating disorder pathology within individuals with primary mood and anxiety disorders. That anxiety is less responsive to typical eating disorder treatment than depression. And finally, the behavioral models support both, and that they feel very similar in the sense of sort of mapping them out, but there are key differences to bear in mind. So taking a quick tour now through sort of the under the skin stuff. I've been talking about behavior and sort of the presentation on the surface, but what does that actually look like on the neurocircuitry level? So there are two main models, neurobiological models of anorexia nervosa. One of them, the reward deficit model, comes out of UCSD. The second one, the habit-centered model, originated at Columbia. So these two models, they both focus on striatal dysfunction. And so that's a broad way of saying they sort of derive out of the same brain regions. As you can see there on the slide, the reward model is sort of thought to be based within the ventral striatum. The habit model is thought to be based within the dorsal striatum. This is clearly an oversimplification, but just to kind of give you a sense that they are sort of targeting similar areas in the brain right next door to each other. So there is on the left-hand side there, in that arrow, thinking about what reward research has shown with individuals with eating disorders. What the global takeaway is that the primary reward value is lower. So for example, something that would be ordinarily rewarding to somebody without an eating disorder, let's say money, is typically less rewarding to somebody with an eating disorder. However, if there's a disorder-specific cue, so let's say a picture of somebody with a very thin body or exercising, then the reward response on the neural level is actually enhanced. So it's not that people with eating disorders can't experience reward, it just seems to be a little bit more specific. Over time, you're shifting to the right, overtraining of that reward response, so to the disorder-specific cues, then leads that behavior to become more entrenched or automatic or habitual, if you will. So thinking about this sort of on a temporal continuum, that both the reward and the habit model sort of coexist maybe in time, that it maybe would start more with the reward-based model and evolve into the habit-based model. And that's exactly what was found, actually. Annie Haynos and colleagues from the University of Minnesota found that in resting state, there was dysregulation of both the habit and the reward networks. So sort of thinking about these two models as being complementary rather than disparate. Notably, there is sort of a flip-flop in the reward and fear circuitry. Specifically, if you're cued with something that, if you're hungry and you don't have an eating disorder, that burger might actually be sort of a pleasurable sight. You might even get a little salivary response, maybe a little tummy grumble, and definitely some activation in the reward regions of your brain, where if you show that same picture to somebody with anorexia nervosa, you're going to see the amygdala and other threat circuitry activated. And so it's almost like flipping it on its head in terms of when you cue somebody with something that is threatening to their eating disorder. Hot off the presses, this is a really interesting study that talks about sort of the role of dopamine. So the striatal dysfunction is really talking about what goes on with dopamine in the brain. And so reward prediction error, by definition, is sort of the degree to which you're surprised. So if you're expecting a reward and then you don't get it, or if you're not expecting a reward and then you do get it, it's almost like the absolute value of your brain's reaction to that reward or not getting it That's what RPE stands for. It's a pretty classic task. You put people in a scanner and you can shoot some sucrose into their mouth at a variable ratio to kind of test their reaction to that reward. In this study, almost 200 women with transdiagnostic eating pathology were put through this task, and they had 120 healthy controls as well. So in individuals with anorexia, that RPE was higher relative to how low weight the person was. So the more somebody was restricting their diet, the lower weight they were, the higher that reward prediction error was. The RPE also correlated with connectivity from the ventral striatum to the hypothalamus. And so I've bolded that in orange because it actually indicates an association between the RPE and the strength of circuitry that in prior research has been associated with food intake control. Okay, so what does that mean? It's a whole lot of gobbledygook. Breaking it down for women with anorexia, excessive weight loss, which was achieved via restriction, wound up modulating the brain's dopamine-related response. So it stands to reason that if restriction and weight loss actually alter your brain circuitry associated with food intake control, this might be a mechanism by which people get kind of stuck in a pattern of that behavior being reinforced. So basically, restriction and weight loss leads to an alteration in your brain of that circuitry. And then that circuitry, which is responsible for food intake, kind of ends up keeping that cycle going because it reinforces restriction. So it's an interesting idea of sort of how people get stuck in these behaviors over time, where maybe they start voluntarily, but end up being sort of hijacked, if you will, by the dopamine modulation. So recapping part 2. Main neurobiological models of anorexia support striatal dysfunction. As I mentioned, there's not sort of competing models, that they're actually complementary, perhaps through a more temporal evolution of the disease state over time. Some of the hard wiring in reward is actually flipped in patients with anorexia, especially compared to healthy controls. And then changes in dopamine might occur over time and maintain symptoms. So looking at whatever circuitry we're looking at, very likely that dopamine is implicated in the mix. So moving into part 3, 2 mechanisms that I am particularly interested in, sort of preliminary stages of investigation. I've titled them Ideas Worth Researching because they are in their infancy. They are both projects that circle around exercise. So thinking about, in the first project, some neurocircuitry that might impact exercise behavior. And then in the second project, looking at some gut-related microbiome mechanisms that also might contribute to exercise behavior. And both of these, largely speaking, when I'm talking about exercise, relate to anxiety-related mechanisms, compulsivity specifically. So exercise goes by a lot of different names in the literature. Some of you might have heard about it or referred to it as compulsive exercise, sometimes driven, sometimes excessive. Historically, over the last couple of decades, there's so many names for it. Whatever you want to call it, it's really not a rare phenomenon. In outpatients with anorexia, roughly 60% present with this behavior. Notably, even more in atypical anorexia, so almost 3/4. On an inpatient level, 80%. So unfortunately, though, even though it's common, it's not something that we actually understand all that well. We understand it a little bit better in rodent models than we do in humans. And part of that is because historically, as I mentioned before, there's sort of this, being timid based on medical acuity. So rather than address exercise directly, or try to investigate it sort of in a very explicit way, most people sort of tend to say, just don't do it until you're better, or we're not going to talk about it. We're just going to kind of recommend that you not exercise at all. So it's been less studied on the whole throughout all of the eating disorder research compared to pet behavior. So we know a whole lot of eating behavior, so much less about exercise behavior. So this is a recent paper that I wrote with my colleague David Kolar sort of arguing that we need to experimentally in the lab study some of these affect regulation mechanisms rather than just relying on self-report or assuming that we know what's going on based on behavior itself. It's just a super busy slide, and you don't actually need to attend to all of it. But I thought this model was kind of interesting. It's a recent paper by Risk and colleagues, where they're thinking about exercise over the disease state. So calling your attention right here to the middle, this voluntary PPA. PPA stands for physical exercise. Voluntarily choosing to engage in the behavior at the onset of anorexia. And then as it moves over time, that behavior becomes more automated, and then moving even further to the right, it becomes involuntarily. So kind of harkening back to, we were talking about the reward model, maybe transitioning into that habit model. This is basically what this paper does, is sort of lays it out as if we're looking at this clinically over time, this is actually what it starts to look like. A difficult model to test, obviously, with all those boxes and words, but interesting to think about how this might apply. As I mentioned, we know a lot more about exercise in the animal realm. Some of you might be familiar with the term activity-based anorexia. This paradigm is basically when you don't give rats enough food, and then you actually also give them access to a running wheel, they end up running way too much, eating way too little, and dying unless you remove them from the paradigm before that happens. So it's a pretty well borne out paradigm that's used since its inception in sort of our history of thinking about exercise in anorexia. This is a really interesting study, and I would recommend it. It's actually recently published in Biological Psychiatry if you're interested in reading up. I'm only going to give you sort of a snapshot. The authors did a series of experiments, and they did some in adolescent mice and some in adult mice. With this data that I'm showing you, they bred certain mice to have dopamine transporters knocked down. So basically bred them to be hyperdopaminergic, meaning that they had lots more dopamine swirling around in their brain. So those mice in the top left-hand corner are represented in purple versus their peers, which were in not knocked down mice in orange. And if you look, if they didn't have any access to a running wheel, they actually did okay. Like that dopamine didn't modulate their ability to keep their body weight up. It did change their level of survival a little bit. So if you're moving to the right, that middle panel on the top, the purple mice didn't last as long. But in general, it wasn't too striking. So it wasn't just the dopamine knockout that did the trick. Go down to the lower left, though. The access to a running wheel. If you look at the striking difference with the purple mice, they didn't survive past day 6. Where those who had the dopamine knockout, but they just didn't have the wheel, survived much longer. And then if you look at the panel on the lower right, the survival rates are strikingly different. So it's like this strange sort of combination of not only the dopamine and the food restriction, but also the exercise. So clearly there's something kind of going on there mechanistically. In the top right, this particular study was trying to look at whether there were certain mice that were more or less vulnerable to this ABA paradigm. So, if you took any given mouse, would they display any differences in terms of their ability to sort of rally against the paradigm? And what they found was that there was less resilience in those knockout mice. So in the purple column there, 5 mice were managing to actually be more resilient, where of those who did not have the knockdown, there were 10 mice that were resilient. So a little bit sort of confusing that there were both vulnerable and resilient mice in both groups, but just looking at the difference there, that the dopamine really did modulate this relationship. So I apologize if mice give you an anxiety reaction. I put that cute one there in the middle. Hopefully that helps to dispel it. So thinking about, I did sort of mention that we know a lot more about exercise in eating disorders because of animal models, but moving, from that into potentially investigating this among humans, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about some of the setup for my K23. So thinking about in humans, some of the traits and features of those who we treat with anorexia resemble sort of, globally speaking, rigidity, that there's inflexibility, there's sort of, obsessionality, that there's a high achievement. And certainly everybody's, experience of an eating disorder is unique, but these are traits that that oftentimes it's not surprising to see the presentation across our patient sample. So if you kind of zone out on that, thinking about what all these things kind of have in common would suggest that there's an overactive inhibitory control, like there's sort of a top-down process going on if they're displaying all these traits. It's really not surprising then that for sort of across all of our family-based treatment trials, those with particularly severe OCD features of their eating disorder, so higher scores on the Yale-Brown-Cornell eating disorder scale, that's the most robust moderator we have of treatment outcomes. So those, across, several treatment trials, we're looking at sort of this signal that this compulsivity is the strongest moderator. So I recently wrote a review looking at the minimal literature that would suggest anything about sort of what we know about dopamine and exercise behavior, but sort of building from that, we know something about reward deficits in anorexia, particularly with appetitive behavior, as I was mentioning. But thinking about if we're looking at more compulsive behavior like exercise, how does dopamine and reward deficits or sort of learning behavior maybe suggest that this is actually a problem of top-down control? So looking at this model of the brain, I apologize that the blob there on the left is a little bit dark. That's referring to the orbital frontal cortex. It's an area of our brain right underneath our eyeballs that, generally speaking, it has lots of functions, but it helps us with decision making, specifically in evaluating the salience of reward. So it's like, is that reward worth it? I'm not sure. So that's kind of what that area of the brain is known for in this context. The purple arrow then is representing a projection to the nucleus accumbens. So the nucleus accumbens is an area of the brain that's within the limbic system, which is much more associated with emotional processing. So responsible for pleasure and reward and actually sort of giving the response. So the arrow represents sort of the role that these two brain regions play in such that the orbital frontal cortex kind of tamps down, or if you will, controls the nucleus accumbens. So it's a circuitry that's pretty much navigating sort of reward response. It's implicated in both OCD as well as anorexia. So both of the disorders show greater connectivity in that pathway. In a learning context, some of you might have heard of the terms model-based and model-free learning. It's a whole literature. It's kind of confusing, but I've made a quick heuristic here just to kind of introduce the terms in a more digestible way. So on the left there, model-based learning refers to more cognitive load. You're sitting there thinking about all the pros and cons, weighing what's going to happen if I do that, sort of if this, then what. In contrast, model-free learning is evaluating just simply how good the decision is right there in the moment. And oftentimes it's much more automatic, much more habitual, if you will, and not a whole lot of thought that goes into it. It's now thought that these two are actually more dynamic and interrelated, not so completely different, but that's a whole other talk for a whole other day. So in individuals with anorexia, a recent study showed that they have impairment in model-based, but not in model-free learning, related to both food and money. So that was actually really surprising to these authors because they anticipated that there would be a difference because food is typically thought of as a disorder-specific cue and money would be a more general cue. So they were sort of interested, like, model-based impairments seem to be existing across domains. In OCD, model-based deficits are globally recognized, and yet they also are more associated with more severe presentations of that compulsivity. So kind of by extension, if we draw these two things together, it suggests that we might find more model-based deficits in individuals with anorexia who exercise. Because remember, I was saying some people do it, some people don't. And the hypothesis generally would be that the people who do it display a little bit more compulsivity and potentially more pronounced model-based deficits. So to test this idea, I've set up this Markov two-stage behavioral task. It's a computer task where you're basically making decisions in which you're rewarded with this promise of getting a token or several tokens. So you work your way through it with variable reward value and wind up with tokens that I'm allowing people to think that they're going to be able to cash in for a snack or to be able to exercise in whatever way they want to. Spoiler alert, nobody gets any reward afterwards, but this is the setup that they're like led to believe that. So in the study, I've got people with anorexia nervosa, those with anorexia who also exercise, and then activity matched controls. So potentially like high school athletes. And then with fMRI, we're exploring brain activation in roughly half the sample, so 25 from each of those groups. So the overall objective is just to better understand what's going on under the skin with decision making, to help to sort of understand for whom and why that exercise behavior might arise, and if it's related to potentially model-based deficits. And then the central hypothesis would be that exercisers, those who are more compulsive in their anorexia presentation, will rely more on habit, less on planning, particularly in response to exercise cues, which they arguably find more rewarding. And this would be reflected by that increased sort of top-down circuitry, the activation. I'm switching gears, going on to project 2. So leaving the world of circuitry for a moment, although we'll circle back to that, and thinking about what's going on in the gut, in the way that we're processing food. Some of you may have heard of Ansel Keys. I think this study pops up in pretty much every Psychology 101 class. So you might have encountered it in some way, shape, or form. Largely speaking, men who had no prior issues whatsoever were subjected to approximately 6 months of a fairly restrictive diet. And after that time, somewhat surprisingly to Ansel Keys, who was running this story, these men started to develop typically eating disorder related cognition. So they were suddenly experiencing body image concerns. They were starting to voluntarily restrict their food, even though they were able to eat again outside of the study paradigm. So it's almost this idea of like, does just a low calorie diet bring about an eating disorder? And so I think, anecdotally, sometimes we have kids who truly, it's almost like they fell into it because they lost so much weight that at a certain point neurobiologically, something just seems to get triggered, that suddenly it's not in their control anymore. And it seems like the eating disorder has just kind of resulted from being at a lower weight. So does that have merit? So that anecdotal, or even what Ansel Keys found, does that have merit? And I think the short answer is absolutely. In 2019, this study was a little bit of a splash in the genetics field, in the sense that they found 8 major centers for genetic risk for eating disorders, some of which were psychiatric as expected, but some of them were sheerly metabolic. So some people were more at risk for being lower weight. Some people were genetically more at risk for being higher in their exercise behavior. So thinking about, do we need to redefine anorexia more as a metabopsychiatric disorder, that it might be sort of not entirely up there in the brain, and then it might actually relate to metabolic factors as well. Since that time, there's been some pretty interesting commentary. The idea that is the sort of dysbiosis, so the dysregulation in gut microbiome, is that the cause of the eating disorder? Is that the consequence? And I think we're all savvy enough to answer that with, well, it's probably both. It's a mixture and maybe they're dynamic interplay. But an exciting time to be sort of thinking about these questions as it's an emerging area of research. So I mentioned earlier, I was going to be talking about tryptophan. And if you're anything like me, before I started to read up about tryptophan, I think my first association was Thanksgiving. I didn't really know a lot about tryptophan other than it was an essential amino acid. If that's a new term to you, it basically means that we need to get tryptophan from our diet. And it's not something that our body necessarily produces on its own. So it's important in that sense. So it's not surprising, therefore, that several studies demonstrate that the available pool of tryptophan among individuals with anorexia is reduced. And again, just think about if you're getting it from your diet and you're not eating well, then it kind of stands to reason that you would have a reduced amount of tryptophan. But it's also possible that those reduced levels are actually a consequence of the way your body processes tryptophan. So it's this idea of, yes, some of it might come from just not having the dietary intake, but some of it might come from the way that intake is then processed within the gut. Interestingly, tryptophan metabolism has been sort of more relevant to this gut-brain axis idea. So I'll talk in a minute about how tryptophan differs from some other sort of processes in the gut, in the sense that it actually can cross the blood-brain barrier. unlike some others. Looking up at the very top there in the middle, most of us, if you know anything about tryptophan, would associate with being a precursor to serotonin. Of note, that's only a very small part of what it does, about only 5%. The vast majority, 95%, gets metabolized through different pathways, the kynurenine pathways, some of which have been shown to be neuroactive. So that's sort of looking at that pathway as being potentially more interesting than the serotonin pathway. This is a recent study in healthy humans where they said, what happens if we just subject healthy humans to a very low calorie diet? So this is research that's not been conducted in people with, individuals with anorexia or eating disorders in general, but looking at what is just the absolute result of low calorie diets. And what they found, zeroing in with that purple arrow, is that there was increased metabolism of tryptophan. So with that beautiful image, zeroing in on tryptophan being increased in its metabolism. As I mentioned, some of these metabolites are actually neuroactive. But most interestingly, when we're thinking about how this applies to anorexia, there's some early studies in the early 2000s in people with anorexia where tryptophan depletion, so experimentally lowering their tryptophan levels, actually reduced their levels of anxiety. And then as well, there's other studies in adolescents that it actually was linked with anhedonia, which is a reduced reward response. So there's something going on with both anxiety potentially and reward response that might then keep some of the eating disorder behaviors in place if it starts to modulate anxiety. So the overall objective of this particular project is to identify pathways in which that dysbiosis, which is a fancy word for sort of the dysregulation or imbalance in the microbiome, might be related with this more complex behavior that we see in anorexia. And so the central hypothesis as an adjunct to the K23 study that I was just talking about would be that individuals with anorexia will have enriched kynurenine production pathways, so greater metabolism of those tryptophan pathways, particularly in those with more severe compulsive behavior, like the exercise behavior we've been talking about, and that behavior would then be reflected by the same brain circuitry that we were linking it with before. So a quick graphic there on the left-hand side, food restriction is obviously modulated by anxiety and fear of weight gain. But food restriction, we know, in healthy controls at least, leads to increased kynurenine production because of that increase in tryptophan metabolism. I did mention that kynurenine crosses the blood-brain barrier, so who knows what it's doing in there, but we're hypothesizing that it might then lead on a circuitry level to impacting both exercise behavior, but as well, potentially anhedonia, and then circling back into anxiety. So recapping part 3, food restriction increases tryptophan metabolism. So not in people with eating disorders yet, but that's what we're anticipating finding. I did mention it's particularly interesting that tryptophan depletion does reduce anxiety in anorexia, so thinking about that functionally as a target. Kynurenine pathways are of particular interest both in their role with anxiety, but also anhedonia, which again, circling back to the idea that these reward and habit-based models are very linked with dopamine and reward response. And then finally, just thinking about even outside of anorexia, there's transdiagnostic eating disorders could microbiome and the signatures that we're looking at with metabolism of what we're intaking, could they be related to the neurobiology of what's going on to maintain these disorders? So I'm thinking about, what does this actually apply to? What, now that we found all these cool things, why are they useful? How are they useful? So by extension, the neural circuitry, repeated transcranial magnetic stimulation, is a very pointed way of stimulating a specific neural pathway. And so if we've identified and sort of isolated that it might be this OFC to NA pathway, then it stands to reason that by stimulating that pathway, we could then be more precise with sort of knowing that it's causal and potentially developing some sort of therapeutic approach that would help to, quote unquote, turn on or turn off the symptom. And then below, I think the natural extension of if we can really figure out not just differences in the abundance or the variety of the metabolites that are in the gut, but if we can actually understand their function, what's the metabolism, what's going on with how they function, then we might be able to develop some pretty neat and precise microbial therapeutics that might be very personalized depending on the person's presentation and their diet. I stand on the shoulders of people that have been thinking about all of this a lot longer than I do. So extending thanks to the legacy that I come from. Also, I cannot be doing the work that I'm doing without funding from the National Institutes of Mental Health. My colleagues across the globe who, again, I cannot do the work I do by myself. I'm fortunate to be part of Launch, which is a program through UCSD, which is leading the advancement of underrepresented neuroscientists for change. And then lastly, and potentially most importantly, the wonderful support of my eating disorders team here at UCSF. So I will share my contact information. Thank you for your time and hopefully some good questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gorrell. That was fascinating and so comprehensive. Thank you for walking through all of that with us. Really complex work. And has really made me think very more thoughtfully about that intersection of anxiety and eating disturbances and affect dysregulation. So thank you for that. And you're getting lots of accolades. Thank you so much. I hope you're able to read those. I'm going to open up the floor to folks to ask questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your questions, or feel free to add it to the chat so I can monitor the questions.
So maybe I'll start. So Sasha, thank you for that really excellent talk. So, I just had a couple of thoughts and then, some questions about your talk. So one thing that I thought was very intriguing is the idea of using rTMS to stimulate the orbital frontal cortex and hopefully, enhance its connectivity with the Nucleus Accumbens and the ventral striatum. So, one thought I had for you, and we can go into more depth when we talk later this month or during one of our usual monthly conversations about your K Award. But one thing NIH is very interested in, one topic area is the idea of priming. So one thought you might want to think about is to prime the circuitry, first using rTMS. And then once you've primed that circuitry from the orbital frontal cortex to the ventral striatum and specifically the nucleus accumbens, you can then go in with the standard treatments, our first line treatments, and see if you can enhance actual effectiveness of our standard treatments by essentially priming that circuitry first. That is a really hot topic area, and that's an area that NIH is very interested in funding. So you may want to think about that, because then you're able to basically prime the brain region, prime the circuitry you think is the target region or the underlying mechanism of action, and then use our standard first-line treatments to be even more effective in terms of treating the patients with an eating disorder. So that's one thought. The other thought is that you presented resting state functional connectivity data, which is extremely helpful for looking at the brain through using functional MRI. In terms of directionality, though, resting state fMRI just looks at correlations, temporal correlations in time between, let's say, two brain regions that you might be looking at in the brain, for instance, the orbital frontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum. However, in terms of directionality and testing hypotheses about directionality, for instance, top-down regulation from the orbital frontal cortex to the nucleus accumbens, you really need to use an active functional MRI task, and there are many active tasks, and we've talked about that when we were originally going over your K Award. But I highly encourage that you use an active task in a combination with resting state to get at the directionality of the hypothesis testing, since resting state by itself would not give you directionality. The other part, and I don't know if we talked about this before when we were putting together your K Award, but one of the problems with functional connectivity and looking at either resting state or an active task, for instance, is that you don't really know if there's an actual true anatomical connection between those brain regions. And so oftentimes you'll get something like a diffusion tensor imaging DTI to look at the white matter tracks. And then by basically combining the data from diffusion tensor imaging, looking at the white matter tracks with resting state functional cognitivity and active test, that is an extremely powerful combination that will allow you to publish in very high impact journals, because basically you can show that your connectivity has an anatomical basis, which is really a powerful argument to make. The last question I had is, it's very intriguing about using, let's say the treatment of the gut dysbiosis. And I just put in a grant to look at the brain using probiotics to treat adolescent depression. When I was reviewing the literature, one of the interesting things in experiments they've done is in animals, they will wipe out the gut using antibiotics, for instance, and then they'll do a transplant into the gut, and then they'll look at the effect of that. And I'm wondering if there are any animal studies that have done that to sort of support your hypotheses, because it would be really, really powerful if we could essentially treat using, let's say probiotic or something else, or giving tryptophan in order to treat or help treat eating disorders. So a couple comments and question, but great talk.
Thank you, Tony. There's, your ideas support why you're my K-mentor for my imaging. You have great ideas and guidance. As for your question, there have been 2 studies that have done fecal transplants in mice. And those are the really only ones that have done anything sort of experimentally to sort of manipulate the gut from a perspective of trying to induce anorexia symptoms. They're compelling, but this whole sort of line of research is really in its infancy. I'm mindful of time. I see a question from Roger Wu. Barbara, is it okay if I just jump into?
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the question is, in clinical treatment, what's the differential impact of CBT and medications in AN? Or anxiety presentations with eating disorders. It's a really good question. And I think the literature on pharmacology in anorexia is not very promising. And I think people like Dr. Downey on this call and other people, this is their area of expertise. But I think from my perspective, one of the problems has been that any kind of psychotropic medication is not as effective if somebody is at a low weight. So it's sort of hard to think about, how medications could have their full power and impact if somebody is underweight. And I think that's part of why they've been less effective. That being said, for somebody with a comorbid presentation, they certainly can be very helpful synergistically. I think as with other types of psychiatric presentations, the comparison of medication or therapy or the 2 together, the synergy of the 2 together it does have the same effect if the adolescent with that medication treatment is at a weight where they can take advantage of the properties of the medication. In your second question about anything on the horizon, there's a couple of studies that are starting to look at RTMS, mostly in adults right now. A lot of our preliminary research in most of these areas are sort of starting in the maybe women in their mid-20s is sort of the average. So I'm hopeful that will start to make its way down into an adolescent age range. Psychedelics, I know, I believe Stanford has a psychedelic study going on right now. So again, these are things that, stay tuned, because probably in the next, 3 to 5 years, people who have gotten the grant funding to support these will start to publish on it. So I'm excited.
Thanks for that, Sasha. Also, Roger, would you like to go ahead and unmute and ask your next question?
Yeah, sure. Is anorexia still, and its constellation still viewed as, essentially the most lethal of the DSM class diagnoses?
So the latest thing that I've heard is that we've been edged out, if you will, by heroin overdose. But I think if you look at, depending on the age group, there's also been a striking increase in eating disorders, either, full syndrome or subclinical over the last 2 years. So, for an update, I don't know, but it's still obviously right up there. So.
And did anything that we've done in the last 25 years move that baseline per capita and making it less lethal?
You know what? You're looking at everybody on the eating disorders team on this call is part of the first line treatment for anorexia nervosa. So Dr. LaGrange wrote the manual and sort of spearheaded the treatment. So our best course of treatment right now is happening right here at UCSF, which is great. And yet at the same time, we do, sort of with great humility, realize that we still have work to do in terms of making the treatments more effective for more people.
Thank you, Sasha, for that. And thank you, Roger, for that excellent question. We have to end there. And this was great and more to think about. I so appreciate your work. So glad you're here.
Thank you. And feel free, anybody, to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Happy to answer them.
Take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.